Well, Natural Resources class, welcome to video lecture number 3. Today we're switching to agriculture, second of our natural resources that we'll be covering in this class. This is one that is particularly appropriate because we got done with forestry. I already made the point that in this part of the country, before many people could practice agriculture, they had to clear trees, and so we went over that one first. And now, if it's this part of the country, the trees have been cleared, the stumps may have been pulled or burned. That would be an interesting study, just seeing how they managed to pull stumps with horses. It was no small effort. And so then other parts of the country where there was naturally a native prairie, that could just be turned over and farming begun. But certainly agriculture has always been one of the major occupations in this country. I'll chronicle a little bit later that it used to be the number one pastime, occupation of people in this country. Not so much numerically the same anymore. I know that at least 4 of you in this class have grown up on a farm, which is an unusual number because I mentioned in the past, well, for the past 3 years, I don't think we've had anybody on a farm, really. So that's kind of unusual. But there is this association of agriculture with the Scripture. Scripture is constantly making agricultural references all through the Bible, from Genesis to Revelations. Some examples would be, of course, the parables, such as in Mark 4:26 through 29. It reads as follows. He also said, "This is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. And by itself the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts a sickle to it, because the harvest has come." Other agricultural references in parables. The rich fool who has a good crop, so he tears down his barns and builds new and bigger. The parable of the sower in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The tares in Matthew 13. The barren fig tree, parable of the mustard seed. The lost sheep. All of these and many others all throughout the Bible speak of or have an agricultural reference, an agricultural basis to them. This would assume that the reader had an understanding of that agricultural reference so that one could make application from the passage. Of course, now, as I mentioned, we have chronicled that far fewer of the U.S. population in general has grown up on a farm. And so with that comes a dissociation, a detachment from the realities of farm life and from an understanding of the farm life. And I'm going to show you a series of pictures here, and I'm going to tell you a story about them, and I'm going to see just what you think about them. So first, the pictures and a storyline with them, and just kind of see what you think. So this first picture, we see incredibly tall agricultural plants. An example of genetic modification that has allowed us to grow plants of inordinate size. Of course, the problem with this is that the soil can no longer continue to produce plants of that size, at least not without a whole lot of inputs from people. In this picture, we have a concentrated animal feeding operation, CAFO as they're called, and you will hear people talk about animals being abused in these situations, where you can see the cattle in the foreground here laying down, and people will talk about how they are mistreated and not healthy. I've heard people describe how cattle from feedlots, when let go into the pasture, can't even walk far enough to get to water. They're so out of shape and so in such poor condition, and that animals in feedlots have to be supported by large doses of antibiotics to even survive. This picture shows you a field that has been so decimated by overproduction that virtually nothing can grow in it anymore. You see just a few sparse plants out in it, and really there's not enough nutritional value, if you will, in the soil to support plant life any longer, and it's really devoid of an ability to support plant life. And then another one of animals, when we know that animals are given steroids, stimulants, things that help grow certain parts of the body, so that, you know, of course we want meat to grow big, we want the animal to grow big, but these are sometimes non-target types of chemicals and can affect other parts of the body, like in this case the horns. Now this is not a Photoshop picture, I actually took this picture, and here we see an unusual horn size in animals. Okay, so there's 4 pictures and 4 narratives that have gone with it, and I'm just kind of curious what you thought of those narratives. Are you shocked by them? Are you irritated by them? Those 4 of you that grew up on a farm, I'm guessing you may be irritated because the narratives that I just gave you is a bunch of garbage. That's all myth. Okay, folks, class, listen to me. The stories I just gave you surrounding those 4 pictures were all made up. They were not true. Here is the truth. If I go back to the first one. This is feed sorghum. And like Sudan grass and other types of sugarcane, it grows that big. It's supposed to. This is not a field of corn. This is a feed grass for cattle. This is a feed lot. How do we know those cattle in the foreground are abused and mistreated? Maybe they're just laying in the sun and enjoying life because they got everything they need. They've got protection. They've got all the food and water they could need. They've even got doctoring because they will be treated with antibiotics if they get sick. Might be some crowding issues that might lead to increased illness, but there are pen riders that continually monitor those pens. If a cow gets sick, it's removed from that pen and put in isolation where it can be treated. So yeah. Another one, this field is not devoid, it's not sterile, it's not devoid of an ability to support plant life. This is western Kansas, in this part of the country. This would be a fallow field. You hear references to fallow. Nothing is growing in this field for a growing season to let it recover. In this part of our country, the soil profile has to build up water levels and nutrient levels, and so this field is sprayed. There is an insecticide put on it to kill off everything, all weeds that are growing on it. The corn that is growing on it was a Roundup Ready corn. That means it's resistant to the herbicide Roundup. So when this field was sprayed, everything was killed that wasn't resistant. The farmer might go in and make one pass through this and till it up to kill that corn, but there's not that much growing there. The corn that's there won't remove much water. But the point is, this is good management on this field. It is left fallow for a year to recover, and it is not sterile in any way, shape, or form. This cow here is a Watusi breed. This one is an old bull. It was being raised in part to see if they could actually break the record for horn size. But if you Google Watusi cattle, you see these types of horns. Horns are common on that particular breed of cattle. There's no feed additives or steroids for cattle or anything that supplement that has caused this type of a growth. That's just baloney. I did that so that to illustrate this idea that if you are removed from a farm setting, you are susceptible to being led astray, if you will. There's a movie called King Corn, The Whole Truth, and there are some lines in it. It says our health is so bad from eating corn. It says antibiotics keep us alive while eating corn. And it says corn syrup was developed because of surplus production in the 1970s. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Actually, corn syrup was developed in 1812. It was not developed in the 1970s. It also says there's no nutritional value in the marketplace. I'm not sure what that means. Corn has no nutritional value in the marketplace. Yeah, so, okay, that's baloney. We know that there is a disconnect with agriculture. I used to, I still will have chicks fertilize chicken eggs in a lab in another class. Any that we didn't use in the class, I would hatch out. I used to do it publicly at the in the big display case in the main hallway. and I don't do that anymore, but we still do hatch them out. And when they were publicly hatched out, if you will, we would kind of keep track to what people would say. And some comments of your predecessors here at Bethel, I got a whole list of them, but kind of the top 4 comments that we heard students say as they're looking at these little chicks hatch and scutter around their little pen there in the early years of their life. One student said, actually asked me, do you let them go in the wild when you're done with them? Yeah, no, not so much, because I haven't seen flocks of chickens flying south in the fall for warmer climes, so no, we don't do that. Another person asked someone, do the roosters lay eggs too? Another asked, which one is the mommy and which one is the daddy? And lastly, someone asked, are all chicks females? That underscores a disconnect with agriculture. Just some basic knowledge that people in the past would have had that would have precluded those kind of questions being asked, that is no longer obtained by people. And you'll hear people asking, this is an amalgam of issues surrounding agriculture. Are you eating free range, grass fed, certified organic, farm fresh, 100% natural, gluten free, high fiber, low fat, RBGH free, RBS free, whole grain, hormone free, antibiotic free, cholesterol free, fat free, low sodium, certified, humane, non-GMO, antioxidant rich food that has no high fructose corn syrup, no MSG, no trans fats, no artificial preservatives, no artificial flavors, and made of real fruit and sea salt, and is animal welfare approved because it did not come from a concentrated animal feeding operation. Wow, yeah. So there is a disconnect. There's also a group in our society. I got to admit, I was sitting at Bethel the other day and I heard a little vestige of this, that thinks they are, what's the term, woke, that they are enlightened, that they now know truly how things are and should be, and the rest of us just need to catch up. And this isn't a new concept. Friedrich Nietzsche, back in, I don't know, was he 1800s in Germany? He's often quoted. He's an interesting person at best. He said, the enlightened man goes amongst men as among animals. So the enlightened man goes amongst men as amongst animals. And he said, morality is the herd instinct in the individual. Okay. And then lastly says, for my brothers, the best shall rule, the best want to rule. And where it is taught differently, there the best is lacking. So this idea that the enlightened really know how things are and how things should be, and the rest of us ought to just pay attention to what they know. Well, I'm not so sure that they know. If some of what I've heard consider themselves enlightened or leaders of the herd, if you will, if they are really that enlightened. What we're going to do is, like we did with forestry, we're going to look at some of the key players as agriculture has developed. Just a quick jump through just a few. And as we start that, I'm going to start, if you look at your notes, with 1798 and Reverend Thomas Malthus. Now, he was a pastor in England, and England at the time had a big population, growing population, lots of poverty. And Reverend Malthus came up with this idea that poverty was natural and a necessary control of population. That term lifeboat ethics was not his. It was coined by Garrett Hardin in 1974, but it kind of draws on the same idea, this idea that we're all in a boat and there are limited resources. And if there's too many of us in the boat, somebody's either got to jump out of the boat, get thrown out of the boat, or whatever, for us to survive, as a people to survive. And that poverty and starvation was natural and necessary to control this population. Now, there was a gentleman that took exception to that, Charles Dickens. If you remember any of his work, I'm going to pull up a video here and play that video clip that makes the point that Dickens really took exception to Thomas Malthus. Okay, there's two clips. Here's the first.
It's almost closing, sir.
Well, I'm here, aren't I?
I said you'd be here. Didn't I say Ebenezer Scrooge would be here? I knew you'd change your mind.
Right, I have changed my mind.
Oh, good, then you'll take our meat.
The price has gone up.
Gone up? But that's not possible.
You want my corn, gentlemen, you must meet my quote. Plus 5% for the delay.
That's outrageous, Scrooge. You'll be left with a warehouse stuffed with corn.
That's my affair, isn't it?
But if we pay your price, our bread will be dearer. The poor will suffer.
Buy the corn someplace else. Good day, sir.
Scrooge, a moment. We'll take your corn at the price you quoted yesterday.
Too late. If you wait until tomorrow, it'll cost you another 5%.
Damn it, Scrooge, it's not fair.
No, but it's business. I'll give you a moment to make up your minds.
All right, Scrooge. Done and done.
Very good, gentlemen. Now, make sure that a draft for the entire amount of this transaction is deposited with my clerk. I don't ship till I have the cash in hand. Okay. Mr. Scrooge, I presume. Indeed you do, sir.
You don't know us.
Nor do I wish to.
My name is Poole, and this is Mr. Hackett.
Excellent. Now, if you'll allow me to pass.
Let me explain something. At this festive season of the year, it seems desirable that those of us with means should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this time.
Provision. Are you seeking money from me?
Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts.
Are there prisons?
Plenty of prisons.
The workhouses, they still in operation?
They are. I wish I could say they were not.
The treadmill, the poorhouses, still in full vigor?
All very busy, sir.
I was afraid from what you said that something had stopped them in full force.
A few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink, and food and warmth.
Well, what can we put you down for, sir? Nothing.
You wish to be anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. My taxes help to support the public institutions which I have mentioned, and they cost enough. Those who are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there, and many would rather die.
If they would rather die, perhaps they had better do so, and decrease the surplus population.
Surely you don't mean that, sir.
With all my heart. Now, if you will go about your business, gentlemen, and allow me to go about mine.
Okay, so that is one clip, and this is then Dickens's answer to Ebenezer Scrooge vis-a-vis, or Thomas Malthus vis-a-vis Ebenezer Scrooge.
Lena speaking. And a Merry Christmas to us.
A Merry Christmas.
And God bless us, everyone.
Tell me, Spirit, will you live?
I see a vacant place at this table. I see a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
Well, say it will be spared.
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my species will find him here. But if he is to die, then let him die, and decrease the surplus population.
You use my own words against me.
So perhaps in the future you will hold your tongue until you have discovered what the surplus population is and where it is. It may well be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child.
Well, that was strong words from the Ghost of Christmas Present, He and Ebenezer Scrooge, of course, unseen by Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim in that particular clip. That was what Charles Dickens had to say to Thomas Malthus. So that was a fairly vigorous debate at that point. And yeah, the next person in your notes is Karl Marx. And so if we look at a picture of Karl Marx, we'll see, dang, dude could grow some hair, huh? Man, some facial hair there. Wow, not that I'm envious. No. Anyway, Karl Marx, Marxist communist fame, if you will, he thought that Malthus was an elitist. And he thought that it was private capitalists like Ebenezer Scrooge that were the real problem, that they wouldn't share food. They controlled the means to feed the population, as your notes say, and they wouldn't share food. Well, of course, you'll notice in the video, some are like Scrooge. Well, Scrooge is like Scrooge, but there are some private capitalists there that were not. And so, well, maybe Marx wasn't right all the time. Well, we're pretty sure he wasn't right all the time. But he, nonetheless, has been a big influencer through history along such lines. Another person that I want to mention, he's actually born and raised in Iowa. He got his degrees just down the road at the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota. Actually, if you go there right now, you will see Borlaug Hall. This is Norman Borlaug. And he is given credit for starting and really implementing the Green Revolution. When I was but a wee tot, and before that, it was very common on the evening news to see people starving to death around the world. In Nigeria, in a portion called Biafra, in Bangladesh, in India, that just starvation was everywhere. Borlaug saw that, and he thought, I'm going to do something about it, and he did. One of the first things he did was to develop dwarf, high-yielding varieties of crops. This is an example of a wheat crop. That's not Borlaug, but that's what he developed. Here, this would be a traditional wheat plant. You can see how high it is. This in the gentleman's right hand is dwarf wheat, and it is shorter. And the reason that the dwarf variety is better, there's several. One is that this tall variety of wheat was more likely to blow over in a strong storm, and we would call that lodging. And once that seed had hit the ground, it might sprout or it might rot and be unuseful. The dwarf varieties were less likely to do that, and then since the plant wasn't putting so much energy into growing a stalk, it could put more into a seed head. And what that did is it increased yields 2 and 3 times on the same plant. So that was a very impressive increase in yield. He developed disease-resistant strains of wheat by crossbreeding them with disease-resistant varieties, and corn and rice as well. He introduced the use of fertilizer. This was not widely used. Of course, fertilizer use, that's gone back into prehistory, but its use in large-scale agriculture has not been that common before Borlaug. And then also irrigation and the use of pesticides. Even currently, people estimate that up to 40% of our agricultural crops are lost to pests. You can imagine how much more was lost to them back in Borlaug's day, much higher percentage. So he did that. That basically brought a number of nations out of a food deficit. India, for instance, now is actually a grain exporter. Not to say that they don't have starvation issues yet; they certainly do, but they are less than they were. And this started in Mexico, went to India, Pakistan, Philippines. Borlaug passed away just, I think, in 2012, 13, somewhere in there. But he was working on sub-Saharan Africa, which you want to remember that is the last place where there are big problems that were not yet solved. And so he was working out at Texas A&M University at that time. And yeah. So anyway, the last person on the list there is Paul Ehrlich. We've already talked quite a bit about him. I'm not going to say too much more. He wrote The Population Bomb, predicted all this mass mayhem and starvation in 1968. He's been doing it ever since, still doing it, as I played you a clip of earlier. But he's still listened to by a lot of people, despite the fact that his predictions have not come to fruition, thankfully. At any rate, yeah, so those are some key players in this whole question of what do we do with our food production ability. Lastly today, I want to just kind of go over quickly just an introduction to types of agriculture, and that's highlighted in this frame right here that you see. So here you see in red what we call industrialized or intensive industrialized, not intensive, but industrialized agriculture. And that's North America, parts of Mexico, Europe, parts of Asia, Australia, South Africa, parts of South America. What I mean by that, and I'll show you some pictures, is as follows. But look for this. So highly mechanized. This is you know, if you like green, if you like John Deere, you'll love this picture. Okay, this is a tracked vehicle. The tracks improve traction and they reduce soil compaction, which is a big issue in agriculture. The more compacted the soil, the less well the plants grow. This person is pulling a planter. The seed is put in by this machine. It's carried along in this machine. Might be some fertilizer in one tank, seed in another, depending on how he's got it set up. And that's all being carried by hoses to little spouts that are behind a little blade that goes into the ground and deposits a seed very precisely. Now, you'll look at a video of that a little later in class. If you like red, Case IH, here you go. This is a piece of tillage equipment where the tractor is pulling this tillage equipment over the ground. It's working up the ground, working the crop residue into the ground, flattening it out so that the crop residue can decompose and help build soil. This is an aerial photo of a harvesting operation. You can see multiple combines here. I tried to get a Gleaner combine, Alice Chalmers. Gleaner is the brand now. I think that's what's leading the way here. And just all the grain carts that are going with them to take grain off them. They'll move through that field rapidly. But this is an example of industrial agriculture. And then if you like yellow, Lexion or Cat, used to be Cat. Yeah, these are all examples of industrialized agriculture, very high end. And so with that, it's common to use synthetic fertilizer and pesticide. I want you to underscore that synthetic fertilizer, because I'm using that term because that's one that you'll hear used a lot. But I'm going to specify where that fertilizer actually comes from. When I say that term synthetic fertilizer, I think it conjures up somebody in a lab coat with glasses and a clipboard pouring some kind of colorful, noxious looking chemical into another with big amounts of steam coming off to create this fertilizer. And in fact, I think the reality is not quite that. Another thing to underline in there is a monoculture. This field looks like wheat stubble that the tractor is in, and it is a field that is entirely populated by wheat. I'm guessing this is a soybean field, and it was populated entirely by soybeans, so that is a monoculture. It gives you better yields, but if an insect or a fungus hits it, you might lose your whole field, so there are risks with that. Major modification of the environment. That environment didn't used to look like this, and now it's been modified. Exotic species. Soybean does not come from this continent, and so that has benefits and costs that come with using exotic species. With this, you get a lower cost of product and a high yield because you're able to do so much with this big equipment. You can work so many acres that you can reduce the cost of production and still have a high yield. The next one is intensive agriculture, and for that one, if you look there at the list of things, there's a mixture of manual labor and mechanization. And if we go back to the map here, we'll see that common in India and China. And so if we look at some images of what that looks like, I'll go back to here. Here's in China. This gentleman looks like like he's working up the field. I'm not sure exactly what he's doing. Small engine. This gentleman is planting rice, a mechanized rice planter. There's two people there. And here these people are harvesting rice, and you'll notice it's mechanization, but it's being manually removed from the harvesting machine. So a combination of manual labor and mechanization. In India, again, same sort of a deal. We see a combination of manual labor and mechanization. Here this gentleman is using animal power to pull the plow. And here we see again in India, we see a mechanized harvester with people in the background working manually at it as well. This type of agriculture might use organic and inorganic fertilizers. Of course, inorganic are expensive. Organic, if you can get them, are a little less expensive sometimes. Manual and mechanical weed suppression, yeah, but monoculture again. They are interested in a monoculture. They don't want to have lots of different species growing there. Often an exotic species. This looks like wheat, if I'm right. And if it is wheat, wheat actually originated in Turkey, southern Russia. This is India, not where wheat originally came from. Moderate cost of product, moderate to high yield. So there's still some significant costs, and the yield isn't quite as good as with the industrialized agriculture, but still pretty good deal. And then lastly is this whole idea of sustainable subsistence agriculture. Don't get too excited. I use the word sustainable. Okay, that might look like this. Here you have a patch of rainforest that's been cut down, slashed down, burned up, and they've planted native species in a dispersed condition through the stumps and trees that are laying there. They're probably building a house right here, just a basic shelter. If we look at this from an aerial photo, if you remember, tropical soils are not very fertile, so they're probably working these areas right here. Here's an area that was worked. It's probably no longer fertile enough. This area right here is probably regrowing to rainforest. We know that is happening too. So the people have to continually move around, slash down new patches of rainforest, burn it up, plant, and then abandon it for another, let that area reforest, and that's called sustainable or subsistence agriculture. It's manual labor, organic fertilizer, and manual weed suppression. Lots of diversity, not a monoculture, but you don't get as much product, a very, very low yield, and there is still some cost that goes along with it, because there's a lot of effort that goes into cutting those rainforests down, as you might imagine. Now, this is just a general look at agriculture. There are obviously lots of variations in between all of these, and we'll parse out some of the details in upcoming video lectures. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Talk to you later.